I did not know this thing was coming out until the day it dropped, which is shocking for me because I'm a big Richard Linklater fan. And I promised these guys that we would link later and talk about Apollo 10 and a half, A Space Age Childhood. And there's a lot to talk about with this movie. This is Richard Linklater's third foray. I was trying to figure. I knew it was his third. I was trying to figure out the word to use here.
Oh, okay.
Third venture down the rotoscoped animation path. If you don't know what rotoscoped animation is, there's a reason you don't see it. It's a complicated ass process. And what it is it's basically you shoot scenes in live action and then you trace over them. This is very simplistic explanation, but you trace over them. That's what gives the images a very hyper realistic quality because you're tracing over live action images. It's a fascinating technique. Again, it's not employed very often, so I give Linklater a ton of credit for at least kind of not really reviving it, but at least making it a little bit more noteworthy because he did it in his first venture was Waking Life. Second was A Scanner Darkly. Now we have Apollo 10 and a half.
There's a really good quick Vox video on it where they explain what rotoscoping is and how like there's some old black and white cartoons where they did that exact technique for Cab Calloway's like film performances, live action performances. And then, that's what they did for like a lot. Like there's a clown, famously like a clown who's doing Cab Calloway's moves. And it's so realistic and it looked, compared to other animation at the time, which was more all over the place. I say that lovingly, but rotoscoping. It's and how they do it in this movie. It took a while to grow. It eventually grew on me, but there's a reason why I think there's a reason why it's not chosen very often because it's complicated, as you said, and also it's not the prettiest aesthetic at first. You kind of have to get into it.
You do have to get used to it, and it also I think of all of his. And I haven't seen Waking Life, so I don't think I can make this claim with complete validity. But I think of all his rotoscope movies, because I did see A Scanner Darkly. I think this one's his most accessible in terms of it being like very germane to the story, where like A Scanner Darkly is like a very dark kind of thriller.
Yeah.
And Waking Life, I haven't seen it, but Waking Life is one of those kind of like interpretive, impressionistic style movies where it's almost dreamlike from what I've gauged. Again, I haven't seen it, but that's why I'm willing to make the claim that I think this is probably his most grounded rotoscope venture. And before we get into anything about the movie, because I already wrote a long ass review of this, I'm honestly more interested in what you guys have to say than myself. But I just want to say this too. I feel every time he releases a movie, I feel like I have to say this. I have to remind people that like Richard Linklater is one of the most, I would say, diverse American filmmakers in terms of content that he puts out and in terms of genres he's willing to experiment with. This is his first movie in 3 years. His last movie was honestly one of his weaker ones. And I've only really not cared for two of his movies, and I've seen almost all of them. His last movie was Where'd You Go, Bernadette? That was
yeah. I was like, dude, no, Everybody Wants Some was really good.
No, it's Where'd You Go, Bernadette? That was his last one. And then it was before that. It was Everybody Wants Some was 3 movies ago, because before that, Where'd You Go, Bernadette, there was Last Flag Flying.
That's right, yeah.
There was Last Flag Flying with Steve Carell, Lawrence Fishburne, and Bryan Cranston. And it's funny. It's like every couple of years, Richard Linklater makes a movie that like everybody talks about, like Boyhood, and then he makes like 3 or 4 other movies that are really good, and like they go really under the radar.
Yeah.
And that's what Everybody Wants Some kind of got some traction, but then like I feel like nobody saw Last Flag Flying. Where'd You Go, Bernadette? I think was made money. I think it was okay. I think it did all right. And then this one went to Netflix, and you don't know sort of the response of how it fared, but this is a very, very interesting movie that is really the bulk of the movie is narrated by a very charmingly subdued Jack Black. He's the voice of a now adult man named Stan, who's kind of recalling life in Houston during the 1960s. This is the era of Walter Cronkite. This is the era of the Vietnam War. And this is also the era of the space race too. And the movie is kind of fixed on 2 different things. It's like nostalgic callbacks to being a child of the 60s and sort of a carefree, danger is sort of imminent, but nobody really knew of it. Nobody really considered that sort of period in time in America. And then you have this imaginative sort of take where Stan, as a boy, is recruited in the middle of recess to be one of the kids to go to NASA, or to go to NASA and go to the moon, because of the fact that they built the pod too small. And they can't, and it's like perfect for a child. So they recruit this random boy named Stan, these NASA agents, on the playground, and he can't tell anybody, but he's going to space. That's sort of the imaginative daydream-like quality that's sort of the arc of this. But this movie, for all intents and purposes, is very conflict-free. There's no conflict really at all throughout this thing. And I took notes when I watched it, because the opening moments revolve around Stan as a boy getting recruited to NASA. And then it pivots to the adult Stan that's narrating sort of his childhood. And I wrote in there, I wrote in my notes, 10-15 minutes into the nostalgic kind of retelling and recapping of Stan's childhood, leave it to Linklater to go on a 15-minute diversion of nostalgia in the middle of a movie about a kid going to space. And then I'm like, and then I think the next note I took was, damn, now it's 50 minutes on this tangent over here. It's the whole movie, But I before I get into any kind of thoughts, I'm going to throw it over to you, Dom. You weren't here last week. What say you about Apollo 10.5?
I watched CNN's Decades series, the 20s, or not 20s, they don't go that far back, the 60s, the 70s, the 2000s.
Those were pretty good. Those were pretty good. I did see those.
You could make an argument, this is being simplistic and kind of a disservice to Linklater's artistic merit here, but you could make an argument that this movie goes so far down that nostalgia route, where this is more of a narrative driven focus of the 60s, of a CNN documentary. And as disparaging as that may sound on surface level, to me, that's more like, hey, that I kind of like those. And it's to have this from a child, I mean, that's the perfect subtitle for this movie, right? A space age childhood, that really does put it in context, and having that kind of, not moral centering, emotional centering, it makes it that much more engrossing for me. It's a very, very light film. It's fun, and it's very nostalgic, even though the three of us were nowhere near born close to the 60s at all. This is, you could also say cynically, that this is the boomer movie, 100%. This is completely pandering to boomers, if, again, saying it kind of disparagingly, but man, no, it's real fun. And honestly, even though I cannot have any memories of those decades, of that decade, I can kind of relate to some of it, where it's yeah, there was a time where we didn't have cell phones, and we kind of played around outside and did really dumb stuff, and we were constantly getting hurt. Even as even me, as an awkward only child who spent an inordinate amount of time on his Xbox and PlayStation. Yeah, exactly. And then watching films, I'm sure for you, Steve. Even then, I was still doing stupid stuff outside with my schoolmates, getting hurt in the dumbest ways possible. The three of us being suburbanites, especially accentuating that. And so in that way, I think on some emotional level, if you give this movie a chance, there is a way for you to connect with it, because it's just that light, that fun. And as I said earlier, the rotoscoping can feel a little off-putting. It has uncanny valley, maybe a little too, invoking that maybe too strong here, but it does have those elements where it's wow, I really got to get used to how their cheekbones are animated, because it's almost there but not quite. But honestly, the moral centering here of the space race and the moon landing, specifically the moon landing, was probably very smart, because the 60s were kind of a shit decade all around in many other aspects. And
I mean, he even talks
landing
about
on the moon.
landing
on the moon. Yeah, go ahead.
I was gonna say he kind of brings that up, where on TV they see all the riots and everything in the Vietnam War, and he's just I mean, yeah, I know now the era kind of sucked, but back then it was just confined to my TV. How was I supposed to know?
Exactly. And they even show that one clip from Questlove's documentary,
Summer Soul.
Summer Assault.
Summer of Soul. They show that one clip of Summer of Soul where it's like, yeah, they're spending like hundreds of millions of dollars putting a dude on the moon when like we're literally out here dying in Harlem. And it's like, yeah, that's a good point. But like honestly, just like the moon landing is probably the one good thing the American government did that wasn't already a correction of the horrible things they did before, like the Civil Rights Act, and everything else about that decade was pretty damn crap. But you know, having the dad play, you know, not play, but having the dad be a working for NASA, you know, it makes sense in that regard, and you kind of just excuse it. So if you're here looking for an ultra critique on white heterosexual suburban culture during this decade, while people of color and you know, the LGBT community were being oppressed in other parts of the country, yeah, this movie ain't necessarily for you. But you know, we are allowed to have movies where it's like, hey, can we just like look at what was going on culturally here beyond that? And you know, you could easily make an argument for you know, necessarily not arguing that, but hey, this movie knows exactly what it is. It knows what its lane is, and the framing around just a kid growing up with a NASA family, and being recruited to be the first person on the moon. It's such a ridiculous concept in the beginning that it knows what it's doing right away. So in that sense, it's a fun trip to the moon and back.
Joe, what say you?
The best way to put this movie is that it's Richard Linklater's photo album from the 60s. And he just enhanced it with coloring.
Yeah.
And that might sound mean, and that might sound like a bad thing. But no, it won me over very quickly in this movie. I very much enjoy slice of life stuff when it's done very effectively, very creatively, stuff like that. And this is an example of it being done creatively. Because again, we don't get this animation style often. I mean, literally the only person I ever see really use it in film is Linklater. I'm sure there's other ones out there. I just haven't come across them yet, or that probably I have maybe, and they're just not as memorable. This to me, like I enjoyed watching this family throughout the entire 60s era, like, and all the stuff that they would bring up, music, movies, how like some people wore back then, like the difference between the two grandparents, where one of them was like, oh yeah, come over here, and like, you know, I grew up during the Great Recession, or the Great Depression, I mean, and like, you know, I save every nail I take out of a board and all this other stuff, and the other grandmother's like into conspiracy theories like every other Texan in Houston was at that time. It's just very charming. It feels like a real family. It feels like, you know, you're just kind of you're really going through a photo album of somebody that's honestly lived in a very interesting time period in an interesting area as well. Because I mean, like, Houston was the heart of this whole space race stuff. That whenever they do cut back to the space race stuff, I thought that was gonna be distracting and kind of pull me out, and just for some reason it just kind of flowed naturally. I don't know if that's because, like, you know, I just started taking it as this is like a kid just basically growing up during this time period, and this is his imagination, like, of, oh my god, like, you know, this is probably what every kid dreamed of, was to be asked by NASA to go to the moon as a kid. Like, that's kind of maybe how I took it as. But I mean, other than that, I mean, it's just a very charming, like, animated film. It's over an hour and 36 minutes. And just the entire time I was sitting there, I just was having just a very good time, just laid back, mellow, learning some history, and watching a fun family just kind of interact with one another, whether it be the siblings or the dad and his, like, money-saving schemes that kept cracking me up throughout the whole movie, or, like, even just, like, the idea of, like, you know, stop littering by, like, taking the beer pin off the can and putting in your beer and everything. And as Steve said too, the movie's narrated by Jack Black. This is like one of the best things I've ever seen Jack Black do, like, in his career. Like, I loved him narrating in this, man. He has a perfect voice for a story like this.